This will help you get ready for the Chapter 11 test coming up this week. Starting off with, we'll go through the vocab words. First vocab word was species, which is a group of similar organisms that can mate with each other and produce offspring that can also mate and reproduce. The next word was variation, which is any difference between individuals of the same species. After that, we had adaptation, which is an inherited behavior or physical characteristic that helps an organism survive and reproduce in its environment. Next word was homologous structures. These are structures that are similar in different species and that have been inherited from a common ancestor. Natural selection, which is the process by which organisms that are best adapted to their environment are most likely to survive and reproduce. And then finally, evolution. Evolution is a change over time, the process by which modern organisms have descended from ancient organisms. And the two types of evolution that we looked at were first punctuated equilibrium, which is a pattern of evolution in which long, stable periods are interrupted by brief periods of more rapid change, and gradualism, which is a pattern of evolution characterized by the slow and steady accumulation of small genetic changes over long periods of time. Now moving on to the concepts to know. First of all, we'll go through them. The first one is going to be how can new species form? Then we're going to talk about how evidence supports natural selection and the theory of evolution, followed by what evidence is used to suggest animals are related. Then we'll talk about what Darwin concluded from his visit to the Galapagos Islands, and what factors can affect the process of natural selection. We'll then compare and contrast artificial or selective breeding and natural selection, and how does artificial selection help support the main points of the idea of evolution. What can happen then if a species becomes isolated from a population? And we'll compare and contrast the two types of the rate of change. We'll wrap up with what evidence may exist to show that two organisms share a similar evolutionary change. So to start out with, we'll talk about how can new species form. Remember, new species can form as we saw in the rate of change investigation. During the rate of change investigation, we saw groups of animals that were separated from each other. Once they're separated, they can start to have different evolutionary patterns take on as they are adapting to their new environments. So they become different due to the conditions in their environments as they're adapting. So as they change and adapt to be able to survive, things will change when we create new species. The next concept is what evidence supports natural selection and the theory of evolution. There's quite a bit of evidence that supports this, including, first of all, fossils that were found throughout the world. We looked at a couple of those fossils, looking at the ancient alligator and also that ancient bird. There's also the comparison of body structure between different organisms. This is the homologous structures that we were able to see that a whale actually has finger-like tips in its fin. Then there's the early development of the organisms. When we saw in the video, you could see that all the organisms started out looking very similar, and everybody thought that the human one was the one that actually ended up being the bat. Then there's the similarity between the organism's DNA and its proteins. Remember in the video we also saw that the DNA for humans is actually not that complex when you compare it to a lot of other plants and other organisms. We have just a very common DNA. There's also very many similar proteins, and we'll see this actually in about a week when we start looking at DNA protein codings and what occurs there. The next concept is what evidence is used to suggest animals are related. Of course, we saw in the Common Traits investigation a lot of details on that, looking at the tree structures that we draw. We were able to see that common ancestors can be traced back by looking for the common ancestor, basically. The variations that have become more prominent or evident are what we can trace through and see that there are many different changes, and we can relate, for example, a bird back through a lizard, looking at as they develop the spine and then develop further into having the feathers and the front limbs turning into wings. What did Darwin conclude from his visit to the Galapagos Islands? During his visit to the Galapagos Islands, he was able to see that the animals have changed over time. He collected many different species of finches and studied the tortoises as well on the island, and is able to see that they have changed over time from each other, but they all start out as being from a common ancestor. As I said, the finches were similar but different because of the adaptations that occurred for them to survive. For example, on some islands, they needed to have a stronger beak, as we saw in the Bird Island lab. And so if you needed a stronger beak, you'd adapt to have more of a pliers-like beak that's actually able to break open the the different seeds in order to gain food. There's also other there's other finches that need to develop more like a hummingbird type beak that was able then to extract the nectar out of the flowers. And it all has to do with what adaptations needed to occur for them to survive in their particular environment and to find their niche there. And then from this, he's also able to develop the theory of natural selection, and is able to see how that through the process of natural selection and trying to find ways to adapt and survive, the stronger species is able to thrive in the conditions. So what factors can affect the process of natural selection? There's several of them. First of all, there's the variations within the species. Remember, as each species is born, we see slight variations. You can even just look at your family, and you can see there's slight differences between you and each other, or you and your siblings and your parents. The same thing we saw with the sunflower seed lab. We looked at different sunflower seeds and saw they're not quite the same. Some are a little bigger, some are a little smaller, and different line patterns on the outside. There's also the mutations that can occur. These are basically just more extreme versions of variations. Then there's the environmental change impacts that can occur. For example, an island could form like we saw in our most recent investigation. An island forms, it separates them, and they evolve differently. We can also see continents moving, such as Pangaea as it broke up. And flooding could impact it as well. For example, if the land area where it normally lives becomes flooded, it has to relocate and find a new spot and adapt to those conditions, which may involve changing slightly or even significantly from the original species over a period of time. And then, of course, a lack of food. If you can't find food one way, you look for another way, and you adapt into those situations. The next concept is looking at the idea of artificial or selective breeding and natural selection. How does artificial selection help support the main points of evolution? This is actually a pretty cool experiment. We didn't talk about it too much in class until the review day, but we can actually take a look at the artificial selection allows characteristics to be selected by only breeding those organisms showing the desired traits. For example, I have a purebred golden retriever. A purebred golden retriever has been bred to have specific traits, and specifically the one that I have has been bred to have strong hips. And so that means that the dog has had, they've selectively bred throughout the generations in order to find the strong hips, and they've only bred other ones that have strong hips that are resistant to hip disease. And so that's a way to help control and make sure the population has the desired trait. Well, if we look at that, Darwin bred pigeons trying to select for tail feathers. And what he was able to find was that he wanted to get a nice big bushy tail. And he's able to find that by breeding only the birds or only the pigeons that had the strong showing of tail feathers. And as he did that, he's able to find that he's actually able to get more tail feathers. And so he's actually able to breed a pigeon with additional tail feathers above and beyond what was normally found. And this actually helps support the idea of natural selection, because if we can cause this to happen, why couldn't nature do the same thing through the process of natural selection? If you think about it, we can influence the species by that much, then why couldn't some other thing to try to make it survive and could help prevent it, or it could prevent it from surviving? Why wouldn't the species try to adapt to those situations as well? And so that helps to support the idea of natural selection. So for example, if a big beak is easier to eat, that means the bird will get more food. And if the bird gets more food, odds are it's going to live longer. And if it lives longer, odds are it's going to have more babies, and that means that it's going to produce probably more big-beaked birds. And gradually over time, we see that the big-beaked bird becomes more prevalent than the smaller beaked bird because it's able to get more food. At the same time, if all of a sudden all the nuts and seeds that the bird with the big beak had disappeared, any of them that had the smaller beaks might live a little bit longer, and we can see the process occur again in the opposite direction. And that can all happen with the process of natural selection. So what can happen then if a species becomes isolated from a population? It's actually a pretty cool thing, as we saw in the Race of Change lab, that different traits or even different species can evolve. And so they can change over time in order to meet the needs, in order to find a way to meet their needs on their new location. For example, organisms can have different characteristics as they adapt for the factors available in their environment. And we saw in that investigation that on one island they didn't have predators, so they were actually able to grow much larger and have lots of available food. Whereas on the island they had predators, they stayed much, much smaller. That is an example of that isolation can causing or becoming isolated from the rest of the population can have a big impact. Next, we have the compare and contrast the two types of rate of change. There's, first of all, punctuated equilibrium, which, as we saw before, is a pattern of evolution in which long stable periods are interrupted by brief periods of more rapid change. We actually can see this by not being able to find many transitional fossils. It's when something changes very quickly. For example, in the last investigation, the change from being small rats to large rats was an example of punctuated equilibrium. It occurred very quickly over a short amount of time because there were no fossils able to be found, and it was also, again, a short period of time. We can also then look at gradualism, which is a pattern of evolution characterized by the slow and steady accumulation of small genetic changes over long periods of time. So in this case, we see lots and lots of transitional fossils because the change takes a long time for it to occur. And so there'd be many species and also many generations of organisms during these changes. The last section we need to go through then is what evidence may exist to show that two organisms share evolutionary changes. And as we've already seen, there's of course the fossils where we can see similarities between them. We can also look at their similarities between their body structures, for example, those homologous structures that show us that they have some similarities between them. There's also the characteristics of their body structures, as I said before, and then also we can look at their DNA. All right, so the other things we need to make sure you remember for the upcoming tests, of course, study your claims and evidence from the investigations in this chapter, and I've pointed out a few that are very important already in this podcast. Also study the vocab with a friend or a parent. Remember, all the vocabulary words we've used can and will be used on the test, just the ones listed are more likely to come up. And there, as always, will still be application questions on this test. If you have any questions, you can jump onto My Big Campus and ask them on there. Good luck on the test.